All right, welcome everybody to the first podcast of Duck the IRS. I am your host, Parham Khorsandi, managing partner and attorney at Victory Tax Lawyers. I have with me Yaron Abgin, our law clerk.
Hey everybody, I'm Yaron Abgin, law clerk here at Victory Tax Lawyers. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we are doing this podcast again called Duck the IRS to kind of give everybody some general information on how the IRS operates. A lot of people are scared of the IRS. They don't know how they operate. They are, so worried they're going to get something in the mail or a phone call. This podcast, especially this intro, is really just to get a basic understanding of how the IRS operates and kind of make everybody feel a little bit more at ease with this behemoth of the IRS. Before we jump in on our intro today, I'll tell everybody a little bit about myself. Again, my name is Parham Khorsandi. I have been working and defending people against the IRS since 2011. Me and my business partner, Amir Boraman, started this law firm about 10 years ago to really help people who are in tax trouble and have some issues with the IRS. And so we have a boutique law firm here in Los Angeles, and our main job is to protect people from the IRS and have tax defense, tax controversy, tax litigation, whatever you want to call it. That is our main job here. And with that experience comes all this knowledge to give to our viewers about the IRS and how the IRS really comes about and what they're really known for and how they operate.
And I think it's really important because I feel like a lot of people don't get the knowledge they need about the IRS unless they go out of their way and do it themselves. They're not really taught it in school. They're not taught it in college. And I think it's a very fundamentally important topic to know because it's something that you'll be dealing with for the rest of your life.
That is a great point, Yaron, because, a lot of people say, why don't they teach me how to fill out a tax return in school? And they don't, which is so odd. You're going to file returns for the rest of your life, but nobody teaches you how to do it. And so this podcast is going to teach you some practical information and practical knowledge. We're not going to go through precedent of court cases or internal revenue code or internal revenue manual code sections. That's not for this podcast. This podcast is really just to inform the people on how to really duck the IRS and get the IRS out of their crosshair. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. So the way that I think about the IRS is that there's two major components to the IRS. There's phase one, or the first piece, that I'll call the assessment. How much do you actually owe the IRS? What is the correct amount of taxes that you owe? And the second portion of that, which is the collections piece. Okay, now that you owe the IRS, how are they going to get paid? Where are they going to be able to squeeze to get that money? And so if we break it down into these two different pieces, you get a really understanding of which section of the IRS you're dealing with. Are they trying to say, I owe more taxes? Or are they trying to collect on these taxes? And these two departments, they don't really work well together.
I was about to ask.
Yeah, the left arm doesn't really know what the right arm is doing. And so, it's a situation that we use that to our advantage. And I know that we've talked about this before, Yaron, where the IRS has inefficiencies. Their procedure is not good. Their training is not great. And so we use that situation to our advantage for our clients.
And it's crazy you say that, honestly, because if people take a look at the IRS, we see they have about 83,000 employees.
Yeah.
So clearly having that many people isn't doing them good whenever everything is becoming so unorganized.
Yeah.
And it just makes the whole process harder for not only them, but for us too.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you don't understand the process and procedure, it could be a big headache. But we've really refined our process and our own systems so nicely that when there's like a pitfall at the IRS or there's a hole, that's where we really take advantage of them. So, I always say a good attorney is somebody who knows the rules and the law, but a great attorney is the one that uses the IRS inefficiencies against them. And we're able to attack the IRS in a situation that they're vulnerable or they haven't really caught up to the strategy that we're using. So going back to what we're saying, so there's two phases to the IRS. One phase is assessment. The second phase is collections. And so what does it mean when the IRS is trying to assess you? So the most typical situation on an IRS assessment is you file a tax return and you owe money to the IRS and they're assessing you this amount that you owe. You know that you owe because you filed the return yourself. And ultimately, there's a balance that comes from it, and then you go to phase two. That's a pretty typical, easy way. We have a lot of clients. They filed their returns many, many years, but now they owe $150,000, $200,000, $500,000 because they just haven't had an ability to pay. And so that's the assessment piece of it that is pretty typical for the general population, but not typical for a client of ours because most of the time our clients are put in a situation where the IRS is trying to make an additional assessment. And what that means is the really scary part and the part that everybody wants to know about on the assessment piece is audits and exams. And every party I go to and someone finds out I'm a tax attorney, they take me to the corner and they want to ask about, audit risks. How am I getting audited? What's going on? And my wife is always tugging at me saying, no, let's go to the bar. Let's go eat something.
They're getting their free consultation at the party.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is okay. Public service, fine. Pro bono, let's say. So the major way that people get assessed is through audits and exams. And the IRS will send a letter and they basically say, hey, your tax year 2022, 2023, 2020, whatever the tax year is being picked for exam. And here's a revenue agent assigned, and now you have to send us proof of every line item on that tax return, which can be very daunting. It can be very difficult, and it kind of makes people uncomfortable because if you have to prove everything on your tax return, that's a lot of documentation that's going to be needed. It's going to be a long process.
And what happens if that person doesn't have the documents or they did not knowing that they're going to be future audited and they got rid of it?
Yeah, that's a major part of it is because, what the IRS expects you to do is for every expense that you have, whether it's an itemized expense or a business expense, you have to have proof of the payment, you have to have some type of invoice, and it has to be directly related to that business or to that item that you're taking. So that could be extremely difficult to do. And that's what the IRS expects, and that almost never happens. So an audit, for somebody, let's say, who's a wage earner your own, and they're making, $50,000, $60,000 a year, whatever the amount, and they have the proper withholdings and taxes are getting taken out, and that's really much it, that person is not really an audit risk. They don't have to worry about it. It's when you start layering that with other things, itemized deductions, personal deductions, then you have a business and you have business deductions and you have an investment or a rental property. And there's all these other things that are now adding to your tax return. Each layer adds an audit risk. And so those are really the type of people that will get examined more often are the people that have those kind of expenses taking off, whether rental property or a business or something like that.
And I feel like that's the moment where for the taxpayer, it gets very messy and it turns into chaos where they don't know what to do next.
Yeah.
And I think that's the exact time where it's the best for them to pick up representation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when you get examined and you're speaking to a revenue agent, the revenue agent wants you to provide like a perfect package to them, which is non-existent. And, their procedure says that if it's not perfect, then they're not going to allow it. And they really take advantage of our taxpayers like that. If you get representation, especially aggressive representation, you're able to push the IRS back and say, no, this should be allowed, or come up with different arguments as to why it is related to a business. And ultimately, if we don't agree with the IRS, we can always appeal it. We can go to tax court and sue the IRS. So we have a lot of different options in the assessment period in order to help whoever is in need of it, especially the taxpayers that get examined. And so that first phase that we talked about, the assessment piece, usually that comes from an exam or an audit. And so we can help people in that situation. And the IRS's job is to get the correct amount that you owe. And if you have business expenses, for example, somebody who's a plumber and spent $2,500 on advertising, if he gets audited, the IRS is going to say, who did you spend this money with? Show us proof of the payment. Show us the invoice. How is it directly related to your business? And if you think about it, you say, okay, fine, yeah, that's not too bad. Well, if you multiply that by their whole tax return, that could be a huge, daunting task. And the IRS loves to deny things without looking at it. They love to lose paperwork. They love to give people a hard time. And it's not really their fault. The revenue agent is just a person like us. They're underpaid. They're overworked. They had poor training throughout this time. And so they're just trying to get their job done, but they can't be the best version of themselves with the IRS limitations that are put on them. So that is the first piece of the IRS that we think about, is the assessment side of it and getting assessed via an audit exam. Okay, now let's say you filed a return, you owe money, or you went through an exam and you owe money. How does that work with the second phase of all this, which is the collections division? So now that we know that you owe the IRS money, an equally scary part is, how is the IRS going to collect on these taxes? And so initially, and this is good for all of our viewers to know, the first thing the IRS does when you owe money is send you something in the mail. They won't call you first. They won't text you first. You don't need to go get a Ralph's gift card or a Target gift card and pay your taxes that way. That is all a scam. So you're going to get a letter first. And that letter, the first letter says, they say, hey, it's me, the IRS. Looks like you forgot to pay us. Why don't you just go ahead and pay us in full? And, the IRS assumes everybody has money under the mattress and you could just pay the IRS in full. Obviously, if you don't have the money and you can't pay, then that's a completely different situation and you have to call the IRS and let them know. As the weeks and months go by, these collection letters from the IRS start to get more and more and more aggressive, until you get to the point where they say, hey, this is the final notice. If you don't give us a call and deal with this matter, we're going to start seizing your property.
It's like first they do a knock on the door. Hey, here's your fair warning.
Yeah.
And then they get to the point where it's like, we'll do what we want.
Exactly. Yeah. And they will. The reach of the IRS, Yaron, is so long that, if you think about it like this, any other creditor that wants to come after you, they have to sue you. You get your day in court. You get to make your arguments in front of a judge. They get a judgment, and then they can start seizing your assets.
Based on the judgment.
Based on the judgment, yeah, of course. Everybody, knows if you get a judgment against you, then they can collect. IRS is not like that. They just need to send a few notices. And once they send you a few notices and you don't respond, you're open for judgment. If you don't respond to these final notices, they can empty your bank account. They can go after your wages or other people that are paying you. They can go after your rental income. They could seize your property. They could revoke your passport. There's so much that the IRS can do, and they haven't sued you. You haven't been heard in front of a judge. They've just sent you a few pieces of paper, and they could do so much just by sending that to you.
Wow.
Yeah. So ultimately, the collection side is just as scary, because unless you are working with the IRS and negotiating with the IRS, they can do all these things and really hurt you. And so if you do have representation, for example, in our office, our number one priority, and any tax attorney's number one priority, is to avoid the IRS from hitting our clients' pockets. That's where it hurts the most. The IRS is going to try to go after their money, and it's our job to protect our clients and make sure that they don't go after the money. And so that's the number one thing that we want to do, is avoid the IRS from seizing any property, or what we call is is doing any involuntary payments, meaning they're taking it from our clients. So the way that we can avoid that is by working with the IRS to get different programs in place. And so there are a lot of different avenues for our clients to pay less than what they owe to the IRS, or for any taxpayer to do that. You could set up an installment agreement. You could do a lump sum that, like we talked about, offers and compromise. You could be in a hardship status. You can get penalties removed. I mean, it's so much that you can do to avoid getting collected from the IRS, as long as you know how the IRS works and that process and that procedure.
And I feel like as a tax attorney, you would know what route would be best for that person to help them the most, because that person would probably not know themselves.
Absolutely.
And that's why representation is really important, especially in a moment where someone is being audited or someone is close to the point where the IRS is going to go after their banks, their assets, and other things.
It's a crazy concept. I tell our clients all the time. I say, my job shouldn't exist if you think about it. The IRS should be so good at their job and so helpful and so understanding of how they work that you should be able to call them and they should give you the same advice that I give you. But because the IRS is so bad at their job, and we're all trying to duck the IRS, they're so bad at it that they have to hire somebody like us or hire some type of representation to deal with them. Yeah, it's crazy. It's our taxpayers and our tax dollars that are going to fund the IRS. And instead of them helping, we have to spend additional money to hire somebody to fight the IRS. It really doesn't make sense, but
they're unorganized.
The IRS is responsible for collecting 90% of our federal budget, meaning that whatever our annual budget is, it's the IRS's responsibility. So if you think about it, that is a pretty big responsibility. And people always say defund the IRS. Okay, well then where's the money going to come from for all of our federal programs? And so this situation, you would think that the IRS is efficient, well run, and destined to be successful. But that's not the case. It's the exact opposite. Especially since COVID, all the trainings are now remote and via Zoom, and people are working from home, and they're getting a little bit lazy, and things aren't working as smoothly as they did. I mean, before COVID, they weren't working that smoothly, but now it's gotten a little bit worse. And so to imagine that they're responsible for such a big part of this country's budget, but are run so poorly, it's a shame that it's like that.
Do you see it ever changing? Do you see it ever becoming the IRS that people wished would be there, the IRS that would help people, the IRS that's understanding and organized?
I want to be optimistic and say yes, but I also want to be realistic and say no. And the reason why is unfortunately, with every government agency, we see this. They say they're under budgeted, they say they need more federal funding, and they get the federal funding and nothing really changes. And it's because look at everything, from the DMV to the IRS. These federally funded programs are just run so poorly versus a private entity that actually has shareholders, that actually is held accountable and has to turn a profit and has to be showing some type of accountability for what work they're doing. They are run really well and have the top of the line systems. A government agency that everybody is tenured, nobody can get fired, they'll keep saying that they're under budget and they need more money, but I don't think it's a money issue. They recently had $80 billion being sent to them over a 10-year period. They've already received about $10 billion of that. And they have made some good changes, some small changes, but at this rate, even with the $80 billion, I don't think it's going to be enough to really turn the IRS into what it should be and how it could be run. Now, that's great for us because if the IRS was run really well and efficiently,
we would be out of business.
it would be a bad situation for us, potentially. So it's our job to run this run our firm based on how the IRS is. And if the IRS does get more efficient or they add to staff, that's fine. We have to change our ways to always react to the IRS.
Amazing.
All right. So, we've tried to teach as much as we can on this first podcast about how the IRS operates. Really, we want people to be less scared about the IRS and have as much information as possible. So we talked a little bit about the assessment side, audits, what the IRS is looking for and how to defend yourself there. And then once you do have an assessment, how the IRS collects and there are different procedures in collecting as well. Ultimately, these two parts of the IRS we could talk hours about and we'll deep dive in each of them. But right now, that's really the introduction in basics to the IRS and how they operate. Stay tuned, everybody, for more sessions of the Duck the IRS podcast. Again, Parham Khorsandi, your host, our guest today.
Yaron Abgin, thank you everyone for having me. And we hope to see you on the next episode. Tune in, subscribe, like, comment, share, do all of it. We want to get big, and we want everyone to know the important information that they need to know, not want to know about the IRS.
Absolutely, and it's great. Yaron's a lot younger than me, so he did the whole subscribe, like thing, that exit on there, which is great. We're going to have these on YouTube, so we'll have a channel, Duck the IRS. You'll be able to find us on YouTube. It'll all be presented for everybody to tune in and subscribe, and we'll have these regularly.
Great.